make up the articulation that only does like this. Thank you for letting me know. It makes up the articulation that moves like this. And remember I said, we don't really want this bone that's nice and safe in that cave to come out of the cave. Like, that would, eek, right? That'd be a bad day. He's nice and snug inside that stable cave for stability. We don't want this. Now, I'm not saying he may not rock a little bit up in there, but it definitely doesn't do this. So what gives us this motion? Those are mostly all of the bones underneath the talus, the subtalar, and the transverse dorsal bones, and the metatarsal bones. They all glide and summate a little bit to produce significant motion. And I talked about the why we need that, right? So that we can keep our foot flat on the ground even though we may be shifting our weight and doing stuff. If we didn't allow the rock, we'd have to... Having that inversion motion allows us to maintain our interlock with our feet on the ground, mostly. Also, having all those little glides help us to dissipate force. We're on uneven ground. The front of my foot can glide a little bit this way, but the back might glide the other way if I'm on uneven surface, going down hills and plains, right? You just need to shift and glide and dissipate. Also, having all those rocky bones from a functional standpoint helps to dissipate force. When we're running, jumping, having all those little bones that can shift, it's like jumping on sand, except instead of us landing on the sand is in our foot. So we actually have the sand that we can dissipate force from. That's pretty cool. Okay? So I'm not going to ask you to memorize the navicular and the cuneiform and the cuboid, but just know that it's all the tarsal bones that can glide and shift. Okay? In other words, knowing the bones help you remember where that motion is happening, and I think it's going to aid for you getting answers right. Okay? Now, the motion for the ankle, plantar flexor, dorsiflexor, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, plantar flexed, dorsiflexed, relative to anatomical. How it might look when I'm standing would be something like this. Bilateral ankle plantar flexion, bilateral ankle dorsiflexion. If I'm doing a toe raise, maybe just on my right leg, right ankle plantar, right ankle dorsi. And I can keep dorsiflexing by making it look something like this. That's still dorsiflexion. This is plantar flexion. This is a continuation of the plantar flexion. Okay? Now, that's not to say that my subtalar joint can't do stuff while my ankle is moving, but I'm trying to teach you that's two different knobs on the Etch-a-Sketch. Okay? It's two different knobs on the Etch-a-Sketch. Sure, they work together a lot, but it's two different knobs working together for our functional tasks, okay? Subtalar joint motion, gliding to the inside, to the medial side, inversion, gliding to the outside, eversion. That's what I'm holding you accountable in class. When all the bones summate for the same cause. That's all I'm holding you accountable. I'm not holding you accountable about what if just this bone does something. What if just these midfoot bones? That's graduate level stuff. Let's just get used to the fact that I can summate motion in one direction, in the other direction, and we're going to call it inversion, eversion, to the medial side, to the lateral side. Okay? So I could have bilateral subtalar joint inversion, bilateral subtalar joint eversion, subtalar for short, subtalar transverse dorsal movement, subtalar for short, left eversion, left inversion. Okay? What would it look like if I'm standing? Inversion would look like this on my right side. And one way to prove it, guys, if you can't see, help me help you. Move me around or stand up. I want to make sure everybody can see this. I ain't jumping on that table, but man, I'm not going to make that mistake again. Maybe I shouldn't have been drinking, but you learn. Joking. Freeze. What's the position if I bring everything back to anatomical? I'm inverted. Wouldn't I have to evert to go back home? Which proves to me I had to invert when I left home. I'll do it one more time. I start in anatomical position. I do this. If I'm asking, remember we analyze motion joint by joint. So if I want to have a conversation about my right subtalar joint, I can bring everything back to anatomical and look at it from anatomical, as long as I don't move that. Hey, where am I at? Well, I have to evert to go back. I must have had to invert to leave. Right subtalar joint inversion coming back would be eversion. Inversion from anatomical, eversion back to anatomical. See how those words work? Okay. Any questions, clarifications before I move on to the knee? Okay. The knee is articulated with the tibia and the femur. Listen, I love the patella. Patella has nothing to do with getting me in the fetal and out of fetal. What I mean by that is if I have my leg up, I can float my patella and glide it and move it around. That's not getting me in the fetal or out of fetal. In other words, until my tibia moves about my femur or my femur moves about my tibia. Now, don't feel sorry for the patella. It has its own little articulation, the patellofemoral articulation. You don't want the patella to get out of the train track when you flex. But in terms of knee motion, it has absolutely nothing to do with getting me in the fetal or not. It works with some muscles to help influence my motion. But in terms of the knee joint itself, fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension, that's tibia and femur. Fibula lives in the apartment right underneath. It's also like if this is like on the second floor, fibula's down here. Fibula has no articulation. You have muscles that are yanking on it, but there's no articulation there. There's no condyles. There's no hyaline that's actually gliding on these glides. So fibula lives in the same apartment complex, but it's not in the same room. It's not a roommate. It's a neighbor. It's a good neighbor. Fetal out of fetal, we're looking at flexion extension. When my feet are off the ground, it looks like this. Let me give you some examples. Right knee flexion, right knee extension. If I was going to take an Instagram picture, I'd probably do a little bilateral flexion and a little bilateral extension. Y'all don't post that, please. I got a rep. Closed chain, right? Flexion extension from the knee is going to look like this. Now, it looks different because you have more stuff distracting you, right? In other words, when I just did this, there wasn't a lot to distract you. But when I do this, we have hip stuff, knee stuff, we have a lot of stuff trying to buy your attention. And that's what I'm trying to teach you, that joints are independent of other joints. It's not that they can't work together, but what the knee is doing is a knee conversation. So if I'm asking you to analyze knee position or knee motion, don't worry about the other joints. It's like growing up with siblings. My mom used to say, don't worry about what your brother's doing. Worry about what you're doing. That's how she talked to when she was mad. So you may see other things moving. I'm not disrespecting their stuff. I'm just respecting the question that I'm asking you at the time, and that's knee. So I got more into fetal when I did this. That's why this is bilateral knee flexion. I got less into fetal when I did that. That's why it's bilateral knee extension. And remember what I told you about what hyper means. Hyper is if I do this, and someone comes and Bobby Boucher waterboyed me to the front of my knees, and my knees went beyond what they normally do. Excessive extension, hyper extension, beyond normal range of motion. Is that somebody at the door? Okay. Y'all, great. Are you doing that? Psychic powers? I'm freaked out. It's David Pumpkins, man. Okay, so any questions? Any questions? Remember, they don't have to do the same thing. Like if you're doing this, right? My right knee is going to be extending while my left knee is flexing. That's okay. They're independent of each other. They don't have to do the same thing. And that's why it's important why we communicate side, joint, and action. Because if on the test, if I did this, okay guys, what am I doing? I don't know, I'm just being silly. If all you did was say, oh, you're flexing and extending, I'd be like, yeah, but how as a teacher do I know that you know which is which? See what I'm saying? So that's when we say, oh, well, when you go from here to there, the right knee is extending and your left knee is flexing. Now, I noticed when I was going over the test with some of you, that was a oopsie. Remember, I've always said, it's from the perspective of the person you are analyzing, not yours. It can't be from yours. Because I'm the one you are looking at. Now, you can make yourself into me. In other words, you can put yourself in their position. But if I'm asking you a question to analyze someone's motion, it has to be their right, their left. Because it's their knees that are moving. Yeah? Y'all remember that? Okay? That's important. That's important. I gave you the example of the golf pro, which is probably one of the reasons why my golf career was so short, which is a good thing. It never would have gone anywhere anyway, so it probably saved me money. But I was a left-handed swinger. Man, that sounds really weird. I swung the golf club left-handed. And he was giving me advice from a right-hander's perspective. So in other words, how he would reposition his hands would help his, but by repositioning my hands the same way, it was making it worse. Okay? Because he wasn't putting himself into my position. He was doing it based off of his position. Okay? So that's important, that when I'm asking you to analyze positions and motions, you can put yourself in that person's position, but it's always going to be observed from the observee, not the observer. Okay? Any questions, clarifications on what we have so far? Okay? Let me give you a couple practical questions. You are driving in today for class, and you're at a red light, and the light turns green, and you press down on the gas. For those of you from out of state, where I'm from, we spell gas, G-A-Z, the gas. So you press on the gas. What motion at the ankle? Notice, I'm not disrespecting. Maybe you use your whole leg. I'm not saying that's okay. I'm just saying that if your ankle would have contributed to pressing on the gas, what motion would most likely help with that functional task? Plantar flexion. You see, like that kind of stuff. Or taking your foot off the gas would more likely be dorsal flexion. Now, if I said there was an emergency and you had to slam on the brakes and you used your leg to slam on the brakes, I might say, well, what contribution of the knee could, right? Well, knee extension could help me. So it would be what I think is very clear to the functional task, and then specifically the joint that I'm asking you, how would they contribute? Okay. Questions? Clarifications? Yes, sir.
So this is about the the subtalar joint. Does that rotate in a transverse plane?
What a great question. It is, so there's some to first of all answer your question, no. However, there's some illusionary stuff that makes you want to think, and that's because, remember, gliding joints aren't axial. Because they glide, there's not one true point, right? I can do this and know that that rotation is happening here. I can do this here. The gliding joint's kind of different. So what happens is that you start off kind of nice and frontal, but then as you keep gliding and gliding and gliding, it shifts to more sagittal.
Okay.
But in terms of transverse, high ankle sprains is what happens when you have transverse plane motion.
Okay.
It's not supposed to, and there's a reason, because it's a lot easier for us to, usually when we want to torque in the transverse plane, we're trying to move our whole body. We're trying to move us. So the best way to transfer that force from our big, powerful hip muscles to our feet is to lock that sucker into place in the transverse plane. So that way, when I twist, I don't have wasted motion. I have to dissipate. So this joint, if you just look at it, man, those two bones, yeah, I'll give you this, but I ain't giving you this. Does that make sense? I don't want to give you this. And then we talked about last class how the knee can rotate, right? So then we get this illusionary effect that, oh, that must be my ankle. But that's happening here. When I move my ankle, do you see anything here move? No, but when I do this, you should see some move. Okay? So there are biomechanical favors why we don't want the ankle to move in the transverse plane. If your talocrural joint, your ankle joint, does have hypermobility in the transverse plane, you've had a bad day.
Okay.
You've had damage. Yeah. And sometimes it can be bad. Like dislocation. I've seen one of those before in athletic training. It's bad. And those mechanisms usually happen when you land here and there's transverse torque that's being placed on it, and someone falls on you and torques it more than what those ligaments can handle. So again, is a high ankle sprain truly high? It's just an ankle sprain. And I'm telling you that not to go correct every person in the world that says high ankle sprain. I don't have a problem, but they don't know. You just have to know that our instinct, ring the bell, salivate, is that, oh, if we have a high, we must have a low. And that's what gets you into trouble. Well, if that's the high ankle, then we must have the low ankle. And the low ankle is the subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. That's what I'm trying to teach you. Does that make sense? Thank you for your question. I woke up this morning feeling dangerous. Who said that last year? Baker Mayfield, all right. I couldn't make something like that. Anything else before I go to the hip? Good? All right. Hip, knee, and ankle are like the three amigos. Independently, they move, but collectively, they work together to do cool stuff. Functional tasks. Don't get functional tasks confused with joint motions. A functional task could be a vertical jump. Jumping as high as you can, squatting as much as you can, or just squatting whatever you can. The motions that contribute to that functional task are the independent conversations. Does that make sense? Okay? For my baseball and softball players, pitching is a functional task. 65 miles an hour. They asked me when I used to play American Legion, because we didn't have high school baseball in Delcom, and I would pitch. I was a lefty, so I had natural, it's not real natural, but people aren't used to lefties. So when I pitch, they'd be like, man, Brian, do all you throw is change-ups? And I'm like, yeah. That's 70-mile-an-hour change-up every time. But my point is, pitching is a functional task, but you know darn well that functional task was because of several different contributing joint motions, okay? So a task can be one word, but what contributed to the task? A touchdown is one word, Alvin Kamara. But there were people that contributed to that touchdown. Quarterback, the lineman, wide receivers blocking. So all I'm saying is that we can talk about functional tasks. In the lay world, they're going to talk about functional tasks. You need to know who contributed to those tasks. I just want to remind you, get you in the mindset of why we're talking about what we're talking about. You have to be able to say who contributed. Guys, this is so important for occupational therapy. not just working with workers, working with kids, working with adults, activities that they live in. You know, to an older person, a functional task may be, I just want to be able to cook. I want to get my pots out the cabinet. That sounds simple. But to stroke patients, and people who are recovering from surgery, and people who are recovering from broken hips, something that sounds simple, you know that it's not that simple. And you're going to need to know who is going to help to contribute to something that sounds so simple. Okay? Hips, knees, ankles, man. Pod knobs. They work a lot as hydraulic lifts. Remember, our joints have components of rotation. But for us to translate distal segments, I gave this example in the first week of class, how a boxer throwing a jab. There's translation of his glove, only because there's rotation at the same time of joints. In other words, if he did it in sequence, it would look like this. I did this in class. I was being silly. I was like, wow. But when you do it at the same time, they cancel out each other's rotation and they summate the part that is translation. And we do that a lot here. If I'm trying to jump as high as I can, I'm trying to translate my center of mass up as high as I can. So I need some things to cancel out. Because if all I did was use my hips, I'd fly back. And if all I did was use my knees, I'd fly forward. So my hips trying to make me fly back get canceled by the knees that are trying to make me fly forward. They cancel out the rotation. They summate the translation. Okay. And then, of course, there's other ways they can work as a task. Thomas Morstead, dude's good, huh? So what his legs do, they work in sequence. He's trying to generate maximum velocity of his distal segment, his foot. So what he's going to do is he's going to speed up his foot through hip motion. And then as soon as he gets maximum velocity of the hip, he's going to continue to speed up his foot through knee motion in sequence. Popping a towel. In other words, when you pop a towel, every part of that towel gets a little faster than the part before, until the distal part is moving faster than sound. That's what makes the pow. Now, let's talk about what the hip can do. What kind of joint is the hip? Ball and socket. What type of axial? Well, this is weird. Look on my first post on my Facebook. Congrats to Thomas Morstead on being named NFC Special Teams Player of the Week. That's cool, huh? Let's do the hip motion that we're familiar with. Let's break the ice. Sagittal stuff. Hips can rotate in their sagittal plane to help get you into the ball, get you out of ball. We call the getting into the ball the flexion. We call the getting out of the ball extension. If we translate that to our ball and socket of the shoulder, it should make sense when I get to the shoulder joint. Why, if this is hip flexion, why wouldn't this be shoulder flexion? Right? It's the same thing. Extension. Okay. This is the illusions. A few of the illusions. It looks like 4 categories. It looks like it's moving, and it is. It's easy. It looks like it's not moving, and it's not. Again, easy. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Guys, those are the 4 different kind of questions I can give you. 2 of those options are 3-foot putts. The other 2 are a little further back. So let's go over all the different. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip flexion, right hip extension. Is there any difference to the hip motion if I flex my knee? The hip doesn't care what the knee's doing. From an articulation point, the hip's just like my femur rotated 90 degrees. Whether or not I did something with my knee or not. So in other words, hip flexion was the same for both. And hip extension going back is the same for both, from the hip's perspective. It looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip flexion, left hip flexion, left hip flexion. Now, obviously going back would be the extension, right? Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Bilateral hip flexion would be like this. Or, okay. Maybe you're doing jump rope. If you're trying to do like maybe a few, you want to flex your hips so that you have more time, and the feet could be in the air so that you. Okay. I would have shown you. I can actually. My record is 150. I would have proven it, but I forgot my jump rope. And if one of you has a jump rope, germs. I don't want to touch. Look, you know what? I do that from time to time. I joke around. Last semester, I claimed that I was an all-state linebacker, and I got recruited to play at Notre Dame. And you know why I do that? I do that, and I'm always obvious when I'm joking. I do that because if y'all have ever had other professors, like professors tend to kind of like, right? You know, we got the peacock feather, and you hear some stories about, you know, back in my day, I used to run a 2-minute mile, and you know. But I think some of them are serious. And so I just kind of joke and play. It's all good. Does this look like a linebacker body? No. So, left hip flexion, left hip extension. This is still extension. It's just that here I'm extended relative to anatomical. Right? Now, let's do it looks like it's not moving, and it's not. Okay. Now, let's do, I don't know, I could have said what's happening at my hips and then go up on my toes. Yeah. I don't know, someone might have said, oh, your hips did something. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. I want you to imagine that I have a splint or a cast that prevents my left hip from moving even if I wanted it to. Okay? I'm trying to move it, I can't. My left hip is still in anatomical position. Its anatomical position. Did y'all see that? That's like saying, if I lean my trunk, my hand went up, but I didn't move my shoulder. It's the same thing. It looks like my hip extended because your instinct is to use global references. Your instinct is to say, my leg moved relative to the room. And that's not how joint motions work. Hip motion means my femur moved because of the socket or the socket moved because of the femur. That's hip motion. Yes? In other words, if I have my shoulder in this position and I did a circle, did I have shoulder motion? But you can see how some people would think I did because it moved in the room's transverse plane. Now, where was the motion? The motion was on the leg that looked like it didn't move. So this is a great example of the two illusions. Pivoting on my right leg to pick up the tape, my left hip did nothing, and my right hip flexed. I had a right hip flexion. And that happened because instead of moving my femur about the socket, I moved my socket about the femur. I think that's where we get confused, is because maybe in introductory classes, I'm not talking ill will. Their job is to introduce you to joint motion. But most of those introductions are only this. My job is to teach you that this is the same as this. And this is the same as that. And this is the same as this. That's my job. Here's another way to look at why this is right hip flexion. Okay? This is going to really show my lack of athleticism at 42 years old. Okay. I would like for you guys to put your left ear to your left shoulder and imagine me standing on my left leg and look at the position of my right leg relative to my eyes. And now on the count of 3, if your left ear to your left shoulder, on the count of 3, I want you to bring your head back up to its anatomical position. 1, 2, 3. It's the same thing. Because this to this is the same as this to this from the perspective of my hip joint. Remember, a joint is a concept. It's made up of the marriage of multiple bones. And it's not just when one moves about the other. It could be the other moving about it. When I was at Auburn, I took classes with engineers because I was a biomechanist. So I had to learn. Now, man, they had engineering way at another level than I did. But I had the human body at a way another level than what they did. It's all good. Because I came from a Cadiz background, athletic training. My point is that the engineers struggled with human motion because in their world, that door is the only thing that ever moves. You see where I'm going with this? The door is the only thing that ever moves. There's a joint, there's an articulation. But when you're building knobs on appliances, and when you're building bridges, you only have one part of that relationship that ever moves. So it makes sense why your instinct is to only give credit to one. But our body is different, man. We can move not just the door, but we can literally move the building around the door. And that's what I'm trying to get to. That knee motion is tibia about femur, or femur about tibia. Hip motion is femur about socket, or socket about femur. Cool? Any questions or clarifications about the sagittal before we go to the frontal? I don't know, what y'all want, frontal or transverse? Do you want jumping jacks or do you want twisties? You want twisties? Awesome, I can work on my boy band dances. All right. First, I'm going to reference something we already know. I love planting seeds so that I could go back and harvest the concept that grew out of the ground. Right knee spin lateral. Right knee spin medial. Right knee spin external, right knee spin internal. Same concept. Same concept. Right hip spin lateral or external. Right hip spin lateral, external. Think of the leg as a golf club and think of the hip joint as where your hand is holding it to maybe rotate the golf club. And when you spin the golf club, isn't the head gonna do like this when you spin it? Do y'all know what a golf club is? Help me help you. And if you hold the handle at the top and you do this, isn't the club head gonna do this? If your foot's the club head. In fact, you play golf when you kick a soccer ball. I mean, that's your club head striking a ball. Right golf club, lateral, medial, lateral, medial, lateral, external, medial, internal. Now, how do you know that it's the hip and not the knee? First thing is I taught you that in anatomical position, that knee's locked into place, right? So if your knee is doing this when you're in anatomical position, you are either genetically gifted or we need to go see a doctor. The clues are in the clothing, guys. The clues are in the clothing. When I rotate my hip, you can see my shorts. When you rotate your shoulder, you can see your shirt. When I rotate my trunk, you can see the clues are there. Skin is just natural clothing, so you can either see it in the skin or you can see it in what's on top of the skin. But the point is when I'm rotating my hip, this is where the spin is about. Up here. And the golf club head is just going along for the ride. Now let me show you my first illusion. First illusion. Like a Brian Copperfield or something like that. When we get into a ball, my elbows flex to start off with forward, but my knees flex back. And that's okay because the functional task is still the same, getting into a ball. The fact that the knees flex posterior, though, creates an illusionary effect to the hip when we internally and externally rotate and our knees are flexed. I'll give you an example. If I cross my left leg over my right, your instinct is to want to say internal rotation because you're seeing a physical something come medial. But the reality is, if I planted this, do you remember Talladega Nights? Remember when Ricky Bobby stabbed himself with those scissors? All right, so I'm Ricky Bobby, and I do this. Remember, lateral medial. When I do this, my hip rotated externally, laterally. Watch, here's another way to look at it. Lateral. Or we can look at it like this. Hip motion has nothing to do with my knee, so I could bring my knee back to anatomical and say, how do I have to spin my hip to go back home? I'd have to internally rotate it to go back home, which shows me I had to externally rotate it. So that's one of the illusions. See, the fact that the elbow flexes in the front, my distal segment follows my rotation. Hand goes in, I'm immediately rotating. But we don't assume, we infer. And I'm just trying to explain to you why it looks like it's internal or medial, but it's not. Good? Okay. All right. Open chain. Open chain. Feet off the ground. External, lateral, internal, medial. Good? Well, what happens when my feet stay on the ground? Then it's going to look a little different. It's going to look a lot different. We've had preference. Remember how different the knee looked when I did this, right? Well, I rang that bell and y'all were like, ugh. That's honest, I did the same thing. That's why I can relate to you. I did the same thing. So if this is like, whoa, 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 I know what my instinct wants to say, but let me just think about it for a second. Then it makes sense that we should have some of the same temptations with the hip, okay? So watch this. Both feet on the ground, I'll do one, I'll do the other. Let's do both feet. If both feet are on the ground, friction is kind of preventing my foot from, friction is preventing my distal segment from moving above my proximal. That's why when you dance and you move your hip, you have to take the weight off so that you can do this. Baseball's the same way, right? If you're compressed on the ground, then friction's kind of preventing you from spinning out. So here's my point. When I go from here, anatomical position in the transverse plane, to here, my instinct is to say, oh, left side spun laterally. That's what my instinct wants to say, but that's not what happened. My instinct wants to say, oh, right side spun medially, but that's not what happened. Cap and bottle, right? Lefty-loosey with the cap, that's all fine and dandy, but what happens when I move the bottle? Well, the same motion happens when the two opposite segments move in opposite global directions. So let me prove my point. Does everybody agree that I'm in anatomical position from my hips perspective in the hips transverse planes? Everything's looking forward. When I do this, I now ask you, left side of class, what position is my left hip relative to anatomical? I ask you, middle class, what is the position of my hip relative to where I started? I ask you, right class, what is the position of my hip relative to where I started? Do y'all trust me? There's a first. Do me a favor. This is a teaching tool that I learned back in the day. Everybody listen. Okay? This is going to help me see how I need to help more. I'm going to ask you a question, but I want you to close your eyes to answer it, so that way you're not worried about what people see. Okay? Close your eyes for 1 second. Close your eyes. Just trust me. Close your eyes. You too. Close your eyes. If you think it was you too, God dog. The Hubble Space Telescope looking at me. Close your eyes. If you think it was external rotation, put your hand up. Hands down. If you think it was internal rotation, put your hands up. Hands down. If you think you're in the wrong class, okay, eyes open. Okay. That helps me. It helps me get a pulse of the class, because I know darn well if I say, if you think it's this, okay. If I'm going to analyze my left hip, because we analyze motion joint by joint, and that means side by side as well, I'm going to bring everything back to anatomical position. As long as I didn't move that hip, I'm good. How would I have to rotate my hip, how I'm used to seeing motion, to get me back home? Wouldn't I have to externally rotate me to go back home? Which proves to me that I had to internally rotate my hip when I went away from home. I had left hip internal rotation. Now let's do that same game to the right side. Right hip analyzation. Everybody go back. How would I have to rotate my right hip to go back home? I'd have to internally rotate it to go back home, which proves to me I had to externally rotate it when I left home. This is not easy, but it's the truth. If my hip and my socket both spun the same way, I wouldn't have hip motion. They have to spin in oppositions to get the cap off the bottom. When the distal segment rotates, we call it lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. We give it a name: external, internal, external, internal, external, internal. The name is given typically from the distal segment and how it moves. However, we have to be able to see that I can have the same change by moving the other segment. That when my left socket goes lateral, my hip goes medial. The hip joint is not a bone. The hip joint is a relationship between multiple bones. Exactly. Guys, I know that this can be, I got a minute left. I know that this could be a handful. My major professor at Auburn, she's the godmother of my firstborn. She came from an engineering background. It still to this day gets, whoa, let me see. Okay, internal rotation. It's tough. School can be challenging. But I promise you, if you study, if you look at it, get in small groups, come early before class and wait, Dr. Campbell, I just want to make sure I have this right. That's how you get it for the rest of your life. And no one will ever take it away from you, man. All right, you have a good one.